Hello. Hey. Hi. Here's the first thing I want to say, because this one word can wreck the whole episode before it even begins. If you hear daimon and instantly think demon, you are already standing in a later Christian courtroom. You're hearing the verdict before you hear the evidence. The Greek word daimon belongs to an older and stranger landscape. It can mean divine force, a distributing power, a guardian, an intermediary, a destiny shaper, a presence that shadows a life, a voice that warns, a spirit that moves between worlds. Sometimes it points toward a deity whose identity is still hidden. Sometimes it points toward the dead. Sometimes it points toward what seems to be inside a person and greater than the person at the same time. So for this whole episode, I want to keep the Greek word alive, daimon. Not because it sounds exotic, and not because it sounds cool, but I think it keeps the field open. If you go back to Homer, you don't really see a clean doctrine. You get something older than a doctrine. It's kind of like atmosphere. You get moments when divine agency is present, but not pinned down. A daimon can be the force behind a sudden turn, a possession of impulse, a pressure moving through an event before anyone names which unseen presence is there. That vagueness is very important. It tells you the earliest use is experiential before it becomes philosophical. The term catches a feeling first. Something more than human is happening here, but I do not yet know who or what it is. In that sense, the word lies at the border between theology and phenomenology. In a way, it's giving the encounter a name before taxonomy. And I think we can say that this is one reason the category remains so alive. People still report that kind of thing now. They say, I don't know what that was, but it felt intelligent and it was not me. Homer gives us the old grammar for that sentence. Then Hesiod does something pretty enormous. In Works and Days, the humans of the golden generation do not simply vanish after death. They become earthbound daimons, guardians of mortal human beings, watchers of justice, invisible roamers wrapped in mist, bestowers of prosperity. Just stop for a second and feel how different that is from the modern English word demon. These aren't spirits from hell. They're more like custodians or moral watchers. This hidden commonwealth of benevolent dead who remain close to the earth. That image never really disappears. It keeps coming back in altered forms. Ancestral spirits, hidden people, land wights, guardian presences, saints, angels, familiars, house spirits, the dead who look after a family line. Do you see the overlap? Hesiod gives us the ancient Greek version of a very persistent human intuition. Some dead do not leave. Some become protectors. Some keep watch on the living. And then the tradition narrows around one of the most famous cases in history, Socrates. I think is where a daimon stopped just being part of a mythic environment and become a little too personal. In Plato's Apology, Socrates says this thing has been with him since childhood. It is a voice or sign. It does one very specific thing. It forbids. It never commands. It's not like it's handing him a daily to-do list and acting like his spirit secretary. It's more similar to a break or a check or a veto. something in or near consciousness that interrupts action when the path is wrong. Xenophon preserves picture in his own way, saying Socrates spoke of a divine sign and advised others under its authority. This is one of the founding texts for almost every later story of interior guidance. Conscience, guardian angel, genius, higher self, intuition, contact with one's daimon, spiritual warning, the voice that says no. What gets me every time I read the Apology, which has been like twice, is the ending. Socrates is on trial for his life. By the city's standards, everything is going wrong. Yet he tells the jurors that the sign did not oppose him that day. It did not stop him leaving his house. It did not stop him entering the court. It did not stop anything he said. And he takes that silence as evidence that death, or at least this death, is not an evil. I think that's an extraordinary move. The daimon here is not just a spooky voice, it's an epistemology, a way of reading destiny, a hidden intelligence that lets Socrates interpret events. That means the daimon is not merely psychological background noise. For Socrates, it was part of how truth entered his life. Plato doesn't leave it there. In the Symposium, through the speech of Diotima, the whole thing becomes philosophical architecture. This is where you get one of the most important lines in the entire history of the subject. The daimonic is between divine and mortal. That one line explains why the category keeps returning whenever people talk about hidden intelligences. Daimons live in the middle, in the liminal. They are the traffic of the cosmos. Diotima says they carry prayers and sacrifices upward, and ordinances and gifts downward. Through them move divination, priestcraft, ritual, enchantment, and the whole exchange between human and divine worlds. Once you have that model, daimons become more than beings. I suppose we could say they become a function, mediation itself. They are what happens when the gap between worlds is bridged. That middle zone logic is still with us. Strip away the Greek names and you can feel it in other traditions. The messenger angel, the guardian spirit, the jinn, the fairy, the invisible companion who gives poets lines, the dead relative who appears in a dream just before disaster, the presence in ritual space when the room changes and everybody feels it, the thing in altered states that seems to arrive from elsewhere and yet knows you from the inside. These aren't obviously identical, and I'm not flattening them into one global spirit species. I'm saying the Platonic middle zone is one of the best conceptual tools for understanding why so many cultures generate categories for beings who are not absolutely deities, not ordinary humans, and not mere abstractions either. Plato pushes the idea another step further in the Republic, and this piece is more important than most people seem to realize. In the myth of souls choose lives. After the choice, each soul departs with the daimon it has chosen, the genius attached to that path, the guardian and fulfiller of its destiny. That means the daimon is not only a messenger between worlds, it is tied to moral architecture and the shape of your life, to the consequences of your choices. A chosen life gets a chosen accompanying intelligence. The daimon becomes the escort of destiny. That's a pretty deep idea. It suggests that the intelligences around us might not be random visitors at all. They may belong to a specific contour of the life we are living, or I guess the life we keep choosing. Aristotle seems to stand a little to the side of all of this. If you come to him looking for a vivid daimonology, still his ethics preserve something important. The highest human good for Aristotle is what he called eudaimonia, living well, flourishing, what we would call the fulfilled life. The term itself contains daimon. Scholars are pretty careful here, so I'll try my best. Aristotle is not saying human flourishing is literally possession by a good spirit. He does not build a personal daimon system out of the word, but the language tells you what the Greek background still remembers. A good life is never imagined as a sealed-off human project. It still resonates with favor, right alignment, and a life well related to what is higher than itself. By the time we get to Middle Platonism and late antiquity, the old fluid category starts hardening into a metaphysical system. Apuleius matters here because he gives a real theory of daimons, not just dramatic moments and scattered uses. As Augustine later summarizes him, these daimons are rational, aerial, long-lived intermediaries between gods and men, yet also beings susceptible to passions. This is crucial because it maintains the middle nature of daimons while making them cosmological citizens. They live in the in-between, and they're not anywhere near the highest, but they're also not earthly. They're the beings through whom exchange happens. Once we let that model stabilize a little bit, the whole cosmos starts to look crowded. Plotinus then bends the category inward. This is one of the great turning points. In the scholarly summary of Enneads 3.4, the personal daimon is no longer, most importantly, an external, wandering entity with desires and schemes. It corresponds to the highest part of the soul, to the level of life you are actually living from. And that is a massive shift. The daimon becomes less like company you keep and more like the quality of your own ontological orientation. If you live at one level, one daimon is yours. If the soul rises, the corresponding daimon changes because the soul is now living from another power. This is like late antique metaphysics at full intensity, but it also feels pretty modern. It seems to sound similar to the claim that your life attracts or generates or discloses the kind of intelligences it can meet. Iamblichus responds by swinging the pendulum back toward ritual and cosmological thickness. In the surviving summaries and studies, his daimons are not philosophically negligible. Their functions expand beyond the Platonic role of transmission. They seem to sit within a fully solidified world of gods, angels, daimons, heroes, and the souls in which ritual action actually matters because reality is layered all the way down. Theurgy is the attempt to participate in that layered reality, not just think about it. The practical consequence of this is pretty huge. With Iamblichus, daimons are no longer just an explanation for Socratic conscience or Platonic metaphysics. They're kind of part of a lived sacred technology. The world becomes densely inhabited, and this ritual is one of the modes of traffic. Then Christianity enters the scene and changes the emotional weather of the daimon. This is where the English problem starts. Augustine, especially in City of God, Book 9, goes straight at the Platonist idea that daimons can mediate blessedness. He quotes the traditional definition, weighs it, and rejects it. If these beings are passion-ridden, he argues, if they are tossed by fear and desire and lust and deceit, why would anyone trust them as guides to divine life? Augustine's answer is brutal and decisive. No demon mediates salvation. Christ alone does. In that move, the older daimonic middle category is morally split. Beneficent mediation is pulled upward into approved theology. Suspicious mediation is pushed downward into demonic deceit. But Christianity does not abolish the middle zone. It just renames and reorganizes it. Pseudo-Dionysius, the great synthesizer of late anti-Christian mysticism, ends up wielding the Neoplatonic hierarchy to Christian theology and creates this world dense with ordered intermediaries, angels, ranks, descending and ascending illumination, basically structured mediation. The spiritual ladder did survive, but the daimonic middle got Christianized. This is why later Christianity can simultaneously denounce pagan daimons and preserve guardian angels, messenger beings, national angels, choirs of intermediaries, and even layered heavens. The problem wasn't really the mediation, it was who was authorized to mediate. This is also a good place to say something simple and maybe obvious, but it changes how you hear the whole history. People don't stop experiencing intermediaries when theologians disapprove of them. Experience seems to keep spilling over doctrinal borders. A church can condemn daimons, but villagers can still report presences. Mystics still hear voices, and mothers still dream of the dead. Monks still deal with tempters and helpers. The official language does change, but the phenomena refuse to die. And that's why this category is really important historically. It keeps getting buried and then dug up and given a new name. In the Renaissance, the old material begins to reopen, especially through Marsilio Ficino. I think the most interesting point in the scholarship is that Ficino draws on Plotinus, but changes his focus a little bit. Plotinus had made the personal daimon philosophically inward and tied to the soul's highest life. Ficino gives much greater weight to outer daimonic entities interacting with human beings, and he places the imagination kind of right in the middle of that exchange. It might not seem like it, but that one move was massive for modern occult history. The imagination is no longer some kind of weak faculty that invents fictions. It's kind of like the surface of the threshold, like a mirror or a medium. The entire modern esoteric story being possible is hinged solely on imagination being recoded as ontological contact zone. The next turn comes through late medieval and early modern magic, especially in the tradition surrounding the Book of Abramelin. Here, the personal tutelary intelligence is ritualized as the holy guardian angel. The language changes, but the structure is familiar. There is a being or presence or higher counterpart uniquely linked to a life. Contact with that intelligence requires purification, prayer, discipline, withdrawal, and endurance. This really isn't casual spirituality. It's treated as the central operation. Later orders, especially the Golden Dawn, and those influenced by it, inherit and elaborate this pattern. By now, Greek daimon, Roman genius, angelic tutelage, Neoplatonic algoides, and the ceremonial magic have started flowing into one channel. Aleister Crowley then radicalizes the whole thing for modern occultism. In later summaries of that tradition, Crowley explicitly linked the holy guardian angel with the Greek daimon, along with other equivalents from esoteric and religious systems. Whatever one thinks of Crowley, the conceptual move is important. He isn't interested in keeping Greek religion Christianity, Kabbalah, Hermeticism, and Hindu metaphysics in separate boxes. He was constructing a comparative vocabulary of these tutelary intelligences. The daimon becomes a portable category, one that can travel through ritual magic, mystical psychology, and cosmic autobiography. And it seems like that portability is one reason the word survives in contemporary esotericism. Then comes Jung, and the subject changes color again. In Jung's own accounts, as preserved by the Philemon Foundation and the publication history of the Red Book, Philemon is not just a literary symbol. He is an autonomous figure who appears in fantasy and dream, a teacher, a guru-like intelligence, a bearer of this superior insight. Jung says Philemon taught him about the actuality of the psyche and psychological objectivity. You could say that's one of the great daimonic statements of the modern age. The guide is now fully interior and fully other at once. It's not really fantasy in the weak sense or doctrine in the church sense. It's this autonomous center of intelligence that you encounter in your or the imaginal field. And that's probably the reason why Jung matters so much for a daimon episode. He gives us the language for the experience without forcing it into some kind of crude literalism or reduction. Philemon can be discussed as an imaginal figure, as a depth psychological autonomous complex, as a revelatory personification, or just as a daimon in modern dress. This argument, much like others, does not have to be settled to be fruitful. In fact, the irresolution is part of the point. Daimonic experiences often feel exactly like that. More than subjective, less than bangable on a table objective, charged with meaning but resistant to simplification. Jung didn't solve the daimon, at least from what I can see. He just further develops it at what looks to me like a very high level. Now, if we widen the lens beyond the Greek and Christian worlds, one of the strongest parallels is the jinn. The Quran treats the jinn as a real order of beings. They hear, speak, respond to revelation, and are created from smokeless fire. Historians note their pre-Islamic associations with poets and soothsayers, which is fascinating because it links them not just to haunting or fear, but to inspiration and altered speech. That already sounds daimonic in the older Greek sense, yet the fit isn't exact. Jinn are their own creation category in Islamic theology. They aren't merely intermediaries between God and man. They're more like a parallel class of intelligent beings. Still, on the level of lived encounter, unseen presence, moral ambiguity, influence on thought and feeling, susceptibility to religious interpretation, I think the comparison is strong. And within Islamic tradition of the qareen, the personal companion or counterpart associated with each human being, makes the comparison even more intimate. The qareen is not the same as Socrates' daimonion, and it is often understood more in terms of whispering, temptation, or close unseen influence than noble guidance. But structurally, it raises a similar question. What does it mean if the human self is not entirely alone inside its own interior life? In both the daimonic and qareen frameworks, the unseen is not only out there in haunted places or strange skies. It's close to thought, impulse, conscience, warning, inspiration, and temptation. The Iranian daēvas teach the opposite lesson. There, you can watch a once divine or divine adjacent term move through historical demonization. Historians usually treat this as a gradual and complex process. This is important because it shows us that demonization as a history, not as the original essence. The being type does not begin as purely evil and stay that way forever. It usually gets narrated that way within a specific religious victory. I think that's very useful when thinking about Greek daimons turning into Christian demons. Sometimes the monster is not original. Sometimes the monster is what a rival category looks like after centuries of theological war. Fairy traditions belong here too, though carefully. Again, as usual, I don't mean the nursery book fairy with glitter and tiny wings. I mean hidden people. Land-near intelligences, beings that live in uncanny proximity to human settlements, beings who can help or harm, lure or teach, abduct or bless, beings attached to specific places and altered time. The basic definition of fairy is spare, but the larger folklore field shows why researchers like Jacques Vallée later reach for these materials when comparing them to modern UFO and contact lore. I think fairies are one of the great surviving Western examples of people-sized daimonic ecology. They inhabit the same conceptual area as guardian dead, hidden folk, or like localized spiritual sovereigns. The general description of guardian spirits among North American indigenous traditions emphasizes teaching, advice, animal form, and guidance through major life activity. That is a pretty different mood from the morality of the unstable late antique demon or the tempter of Christian demonology. It is much closer to Socrates' sign and the tutelary genius, as well as certain modern reports of spiritual guidance voices. This is why I keep saying we need family resemblance rather than a single essence. There are structural similarities. Then different civilizations weight moral tone, cosmology, and ritual relation in completely different ways. Of course, we have to walk into the modern psychological question, because if you don't do that, then I guess I'm not really taking this seriously, am I? Contemporary research on voice hearing, inner speech, and spiritually significant voices makes one thing pretty clear. Hearing a voice is not a clean diagnostic line between sanity and madness. There are non-psychotic voice hearers. There are spiritually meaningful voices that are infrequent, low impairment, and experienced as helpful. There are clinical voices that are cruel, invasive, destabilizing, and destructive. And there are also borderline cases that cut through all these categories. Serious researchers explicitly warn against lazy extremes, declaring all voices divine or declaring all voices disease. The actual phenomenology is mixed, culturally shaped, and oftentimes pretty ambiguous. The ambiguity is exactly where the daimonic belongs, though. A daimonic framework does not force me to say every inner voice is a real external entity. It just gives me language for experiences that present themselves as intelligent, meaningful, or something more than the ego. Some of those experiences might be products of memory or trauma, dissociation, like some kind of obsessive cognition, or even like misattributing inner speech. We can use research on intrusive thoughts as an important warning here. Minds do generate alien feeling matter all the time. An unwanted thought can arrive with force, horror, and a surprising amount of conviction. A person can easily interpret what is self-generated as foreign. That possibility has to stay on the table. A serious occult historian, which I'm not sure if either of us are, but why not, would not be afraid of psychological explanation. Usually they know that psychological explanation is one of the things that tradition itself has always been dealing with. At the same time, psychological explanation does not cancel the anthropological fact that many communities experience such events inside these robust spirit ontologies. Studies of jinn attribution in psychiatric and transcultural settings show that people still interpret misfortune, distress, and anomalous experiences through categories of non-human agency. I know it sounds like medieval leftovers, but this is a living interpretation. And I think once you see that, you will realize that daimons are not just dead Greek ideas. This is a recurring human pattern. When agency is felt but not visibly human, communities reach for middle being categories. Whether it's spirit, jinn, angel, witchcraft, guide, possession, calling, inspiration. The names differ for sure, I agree with you. But can you tell that there is interpretive labor going on right now? People are still categorizing things this way. This is where modern high strangeness comes in. Jacques Vallée, especially in Passport to Megonia, which I know I mention a lot, but it's relevant again, so it's not my fault. He makes a comparative argument that I think you'll see is still pretty relevant. He lines up folklore reports, medieval records, modern UFO cases, landed entity encounters, absurd humanoids, fairies, contact narratives, and says, look at the pattern. The encounter structure is familiar. The imagery is just shifting with culture. That doesn't prove one single cause behind everything, of course. It does something that I think is almost as important. It's a spell breaker. The dark curse of presentism is broken. It stops us from imagining that aliens are a brand new modern category. Like we've said before, it might just be modern clothing on a much older pattern of encounter. And I suppose this is why the daimonic is such a useful word for the 20th and 21st centuries. It's broad enough to include vision, apparition, dream, synchronicity, trickster intelligence, without forcing them all into the same literal mechanism. Rice's Archives of the Impossible make that point institutionally. Jeffrey Kripal describes these records of things that are not supposed to happen, but do. That sentence is like a modern daimonic manifesto. Kripal went even further in this public interview that I mention often, where he argues that thinking about UFOs only as spaceships is naive, that they may be tied to our spiritual histories in ways we don't understand. He also says that trauma or grief might alter the mediation between mind and world. I'm not saying I take that as proof of a theory, but it's definitely a warning against bad categories. And the demonic has always existed in the place where categories seem to fail. Inside and outside, spirit and psyche, encounter and projection, message and symptom. If you can only handle one side of those pairs, you'll probably miss most of the data. So what finally is a daimon? Here's the answer I would give after a few decades of thinking about it. A daimon is a historically durable name for experienced intelligence at the threshold of the human. Sometimes the threshold is cosmic, sometimes it's moral. It can be psychological, even social. The old Greek sources don't really hand us a simple doctrine, and I look at that as a gift. It means the category is flexible enough to survive to this day where I'm talking about it to you right now. In one age, it means the hidden machinery of fate, and in another, it's like the moral escort for the soul. Then somehow it turns into a deceptive intermediary, and eventually a guardian angel. And finally, now, when you're listening to this, it's morphed into the structure behind these impossible encounters that modern culture keeps rebranding as extraterrestrial, paranormal, or anomalous. And I've been thinking about this for so long, but one thing that keeps coming up is that the oldest sources don't talk like modern skeptics or believers. They assume that human beings are porous, and I know I've been saying that word a lot lately. I probably need to stop. They assume a life can be accompanied and not entirely alone. They assume that your thoughts can be interrupted, and they assume that moral action and unseen presence aren't in separate rooms. I think we often treat that worldview as some kind of embarrassment that modern society has left far behind. But the reports keep coming. Guidance voices, death coincidence dreams, impossible presences, visitation narratives, abduction stories, negative entities, trauma-related experience, and the archive keeps growing. So much like my thoughts about fairies, the question isn't whether daimons actually exist in a crude sense. Maybe the deeper question is why this particular kind of intelligence keeps showing up at the edge of our understanding. Why do cultures so far apart keep making room for these beings who are close and clever and morally mixed and hard to classify? Why do the guardians you encounter sometimes look like the dead? Why does your inspiration feel received? Why do grief, solitude, danger, and altered consciousness so often become recruitment centers for presences? I think that's where this question, the demonic question, sits. Not in some dead lexicon, but in the fact that people continue to meet something inside or around themselves and say, it knew me, it warned me, it tricked me, it taught me. It wasn't exactly me, but it somehow was kind of me. If I had to leave you with one image after all this ranting, I would leave you with Diotima's. Between the divine and mortal, that's where the daimons live. And maybe that's also where a lot of our life is lived, whether we want to admit it or not. Maybe we are existing in the liminal. We are the kind of beings who act like the world is unfinished. So it makes sense that the intelligences we report aren't pure absolutes. They're middle beings for middle creatures. Nearby powers for a species that keeps standing on thresholds, but maybe refusing to cross over. And that, for me, that middleness is why the daimon has never gone away.